Clarksville, Tennessee, the home of the Govs, a military town, named #1 place to live by Money.com in 2019. According to a 2020 census, Clarksville is home to over 160,000 people. Like much of the United States, Clarksville is rich with history, although a lot of it has been purposefully hidden for a long time.
My name is Fredrick Murphy, and I am a documentarian as well as a licensed clinical mental health therapist. Some of the organizations that I am involved with are the Slave Dwelling Project, which is a project that's located out of Charleston, South Carolina. And what we do is we provide a different look at plantations sites, right? So you know that individuals get this big Gone with the Wind ideology of what plantation sites are, but those big homes do not exist if it's not for the homes that were in the back, meaning the enslaved labor. So what we do with that specific project is we stay the night in existing slave dwellings to bring awareness to these buildings, as well as paying homage and acknowledge the ancestors who were responsible for the economic fabric of this country. The James K. Polk site, James K. Polk was the 11th president here in the United States of America. His home site is in North Carolina, where I currently live, and we're doing a lot of great things with that site as it relates to making sure that it provides a more inclusive story for individuals that visit the historic site. And the Tennessee AfricanAmerican Historical Research Group, which is here in Clarksville, Tennessee, my hometown. And what we focus on is bringing awareness to African-American history in the state of Tennessee, but also, we focus here in Montgomery County, Dixon County, as well as Hopkinsville, Kentucky.
Fredrick says his passion stems from having the lack of education he did in Clarksville when he was in school.
And, I don't know if it was a school state curriculum thing or if it was just me recognizing so many beautiful places as it relates to African American history that my ancestors and my peers' ancestors had direct dealings with, that made me be more inquisitive and say, hey, let's amplify the voices of those individuals who maybe at that point of time didn't have the ability to do so for themselves due to the time that they were in. I truly believe that our ancestors all live within us, and it's our obligation, it's part of our debt to be here on earth to kind of keep carrying on the things that they set out to do. And so anything that I could have done or can do to make sure that those legacies are continued, I do such. And so that's where a lot of the passion came from, just knowing how deeply rooted my family has been in this community, and I want to carry that on.
Since the founding of the Tennessee African American Historical Group in 2021, they've researched and worked to place 4 historical markers for the 101st United States Colored Troops, the Negro Agricultural Fair, AfricanAtown, and the slave market. The placement of historical markers was an effort that was mostly spearheaded by Jackie Collins, who funded signs for the Burt School, Bailey Cobb Elementary School, for baseball player Steve Wiley, and at St. John Missionary Baptist Church. He is also a founding member of the group, along with Tracy Jepson.
Yeah, I have a master's in history from the University of Memphis. So what I enjoy doing the most is researching and unearthing unknown parts of the story and sharing that in multiple formats. I've worked as a public historian in Tennessee for 9 years, and I became very interested in African American history in our community. I noticed a lot of the history was imbalanced, and I wanted to find the stories. And so I met Fredrick Deshawn Murphy when I was working as a historical interpreter at Fort Defiance, and we both shared a passion for this. And we began a nonprofit called the Tennessee African American Historical Group. And to date, we have done the research and procured the funding and got approval from the State Historical Commission for 4 new markers in Montgomery County about African American history. One that is really dear to my heart is about the slave market in Clarksville. So why did I want to research the slave market? Because this is a group of people from the past in our community that deserve to be acknowledged. They deserve for their experience and their life in Montgomery County in the mid-19th century to be fully explored, acknowledged, and respected. I began to look through old newspaper clippings, and I would see where people were being sold. Here's a newspaper clipping. This is from the Clarksville Gazette in 1820. And this is showing that human beings are being sold in downtown Clarksville. Also, you'll see a lot of advertisements like this in Clarksville during the time where people are being sold along with mules and other farm animals. I noticed that the sales were happening at the county courthouse, which before 1878, if you look at the old Clarksville maps in the archives, you'll see it was on Franklin Street, kind of across from where the Black Horse Pub is now. They were also sold, according to the newspaper clippings, in the Market Square or the Market House, which is where Public Square is now, almost where City Hall is now. It is all about recognizing and giving dignity to a group of people who did exist, who should not be erased from our city's history, even though it is ugly and dark, the history that occurred.
The project and everything that we're doing is shedding so much light on something that has been covered intentionally, because people know about these things. People know that the 101st USCT headquarters was right there at where the Dunn Center is, and we'll be showing that. The Negro Fairgrounds was right there on the Austin Peay grounds. The slave market here in Clarksville was on 2nd and Franklin. People know these things. This oral history has been passed down from one generation to the next, and we've just been blessed that we've been given the blessing by some of the higher ups here in Montgomery County to have these signs erected.
One thing that the Tennessee African American Historical Group works to do is to uncover these stories. However, this can be a months or even years-long process. There are many stories that are still untold simply because they're not easy to find.
So my name is David Britton. I'm the park manager for Dunbar Cave State Park and Port Royal State Historic Park for Tennessee State Parks. One of the core values of Tennessee State Parks is to preserve and protect the stories and the cultural resources that make up our heritage as Tennesseans. Well, if we're looking at that in an inclusive light, well, that's more than just the traditional narrative that we ourselves in parks have been part of telling. It requires us to look deeper and do the hard work, ask the hard questions.
David says that over the years at the parks he manages, Dunbar Cave and Port Royal, him and his team have worked to find inclusive stories that are hard to find in the archives.
From a purely archival and historian standpoint, it's more difficult just because it requires very finely tuned, developed research skills.
Because there are no journals and letters left, because this is a group of people that was forced to be illiterate.
I absolutely think that the marginalization of individuals' voices and their experiences is the exact reason in why it takes so long to uncover these different stories as it relates to Black history in Clarksville. For instance, when we talk about the tobacco industry, a lot of individuals, these planters who came down from North Carolina and Virginia, their enslaved labor, that was their responsibility, was to clear out land in order to grow tobacco. And not only that, in this specific area, we had a lot of furnaces. So those furnaces were utilized to create arms, bullets and things like that, cannons for the War of 1812 all the way up to the Civil War, right? But you don't hear about a lot of these things that this county was part of. So yes, I definitely believe that marginalizing the Black population over the period of history in this county, in this state, and in this country has continued to oppress these specific voices that have that have given for free so much to this place.
It takes a lot of digging to find these stories because of systemic racism. It's not an overtly malevolent thing that took place to hide stories, but when the primary narrative is one that glorifies and exemplifies the white population exclusively, and you do that for 100 years, all the other stories kind of fall through the cracks. We don't necessarily notice it, see it in our everyday, day in and day out interactions, but it's there informing the way that those relationships are happening. So we have to take a step back, look at the situation, and ask hard questions, expect difficult conversations with ourselves and of ourselves to recognize where these deficiencies are at. And when you see them, you call them out. And that's where you start doing work.
We are created by the past. Everything, of course. I mean, I know this sounds like common sense, but we're creating the future right now for who live in the future, the structures we create, the decisions that we make or don't make. And we are a product of everything that happened during this time period. I think sometimes we think it's something that happened and it's over with, and no, it all has repercussions on our social structures today.
When we look at things such as pay, when we look at things such as what school a person attended, if you attended a HBCU, right now we're seeing a lot of things happening in the housing market where people of African descent are having to remove everything that relates to their blackness in order for them to get their house to be appraised the same value as their white counterparts, right? So that's what marginalization is. It's to make you feel small. It is to make you feel inferior to individuals who created this superior state of being. For myself personally, there has been numerous times in which my peers have made, my white counterparts have made way more money than me. Less degreed, less experience, less responsibilities, and have made more money than me. That's just one example. Other examples, I truly feel, as it relates to my family, we were sharecroppers. My family were sharecroppers here in Montgomery County. And my great-grandmother would tell us at the end of the year, they would get $100. They worked the whole year and get $100. They had 13 kids. So like many different migrations out the South for black and brown folks, they went up north seeking for something better. Those are ways to marginalize and control a certain population of individuals. So that's innate in me, as well as my own personal experiences, such as the different pay structures, interest rates being higher for my home. My first home that I purchased, I found out that my interest rate was higher, even though my credit score was what it needed to be. So it is something that transcends over time. It's manipulated, and if you aren't able to advocate for yourself, sometimes you'll just be completely oblivious to what it is, and you don't even recognize that you're falling behind further and further.
To understand what it takes to find these stories, I visited Mount Olive Cemetery. There are many divots in the ground indicating an unmarked grave. Some areas have pieces of a headstone or footstone. If you're lucky, you can find a full headstone with the person's name and approximation of their birth and death time.
We found a home. It was a new house, and I think we signed the contract in March and we came in April. And in April, we wanted just to see the process and how things were looking. And so when we got to the home, first of all, we didn't have anything on the GPS to find it. The address was not there. So we used a landmark close by. And that landmark happened to be Mount Olive Cemetery. We just used the address, 931 Cumberland Drive, but we knew nothing about the cemetery, and I was expecting it to be behind the house and to look like an open space with flowers and grass and, kind of a rolling hills kind of look. So we get here, we see the home, it's nothing but a wooden structure, and I go to the backyard, and right now we have a fence, but before that there was not, and I just looked out and I was wondering, where is this cemetery that got us here? And as I looked closer, I saw a headstone, pretty sizable one, and I walked out there, and I remember it said Ann Stewart Cobb. Died November 24th, 1912, aged about 65 years. And I was like, okay, first of all, aged about 65 years was something that struck me. I would expect birth date, death date, exact dates. So then I'm like, okay. And then I looked up Mount Olive and I figured out what it was. And that's when I called or applied to be on a member of the society. And then we got here in June, and I called Mike, who'd been in contact with me, and he came out and gave me a tour similar to what we're going through today. And based on that tour, we ended the tour with what he said to all of us, that I asked him what his motivation was for being a part of this. And he said, you know, we all will die once, and when you forget about a person's memory, that is when you die twice. And so I wrote that in my phone, the title, and I was hoping a song would come to me one day that I could just present to Mike. And based on that, the song came to me in August, and I played it for Mike, and then it's been a part of kind of our regular little repertoire of events that we do. And it's called You Won't Die Twice. He said the Lord's Prayer, did it one by one, for that father, mother, daughter, and their son. And through his tears, he promised all of them that they'd only died this one time, and their memories would live. He worked all in his life, traveling round this world, serving the army, protecting boys and girls. And through these years, his love for others grew, and he vowed to be a fighter for something so long overdue. He found a place where they were buried, set their headstones up straight. Some were babies, some were married, others patiently await for the day he comes and finds them, keeps their memories alive. He says you may have died one time, but you won't die twice.
At the time that I got involved with Mount Olive, I also started getting involved with Fort Defiance. I got a petition going to get them to fund an interpretive center up there. And then somebody called me and told me at the next council meeting that they were going to be talking about something on Fort Defiance. So I went to that city council meeting, and the information was incorrect. But what they were talking about was Mount Olive, and that's where I first met Geneva Bell, the founder of Mount Olive Cemetery Historical Preservation Society. Geneva was a force unto herself. She was never still. She was always planning the next big event that we were going to support. And we had 5 people on the board, so it was kind of exhausting. She got ill, and she turned the society over to Mike Taliento, who was reconstructing the board, and she recommended me as a board member. So I met with him, and he's a retired officer, so he had his vision of the board and the positions for it all laid out. And so he put them in front of me and gave me his briefing and asked me which position that I wanted to hold. And I said historian. And I've been the historian now for the last 6 or 7 years. We've explored the deed for this area as far back as we can get, which is back into like 1880. Although our first burial here is 1817. The second thing is that I researched the lives of the people that are here. And then the third thing is that I research who's actually buried here.
Holding educational engagements is to give people an opportunity to make a connection with Clarksville's history and African American history. And the nation's history, for that matter, with all of the veterans that are buried in here. So I think the reaction initially is it's a special place, like Nick said. It's a very serene environment. It's quiet, and it's literally in Clarksville's backyard.
The challenges you run into are things like, they didn't issue birth certificates, they didn't issue death certificates. These people did not leave big, huge paper trails. If they don't mess up their names on it, you can find them like in the census, you can find them in city directories, telling you where they lived. If you're very lucky, they did something to be mentioned in the newspaper. If you're very, very lucky, they have an obituary. The way that someone gets on my spreadsheet on either the military side or the civilian side is the first and most accurate way is you've got a headstone in the cemetery. If you've got a headstone, you're in there. So you're automatically on the list, whether I find anything else out about you or not. The second way you get on the list is if I have a death certificate that says you're buried there. The third thing is an obituary. I found obituaries where they state they're going to be buried here and they're not that. Usually I like to look for other evidence, but if I can't find any other evidence and I can't find evidence that you're in another cemetery, then I will put you on the spreadsheet. And then the fourth way is that there's a deposition in a pension record that says you're buried there. Every death certificate that says they were buried in Mount Olive, I'll save them to a file in my computer. And then what I do is I go back and go, oh, this person looks interesting. Let me see if I can't find anything on them. And, sometimes you hit wonderful, wonderful pay dirt. It's like Christmas presents all year long. We have 270 civilians on that spreadsheet and 32 veterans. And when I first started this job, we had identified like 107 people, and that included 20 veterans. I look around, there's a historical highway marker for Dr. Burt's infirmary. Wilma Rudolph Boulevard, Wilma Rudolph's statue and events center. There's at least 2 schools named after, one's named after Dr. Burt and one's named after a prominent black educator. But, there's not a lot of commemoration of the African-American history in this town. I'm an Army veteran, retired. We live in an Army town. We have Fort Campbell up the road. Every business you go, we love our soldiers, thank a veteran. We will never forget your sacrifice. I have a large number of veterans that are buried in Mount Olive. And as a veteran myself, I always think, okay, you tell me you'll never forget my sacrifice. You need to prove it by remembering the sacrifice of these men and their families.
The question that this research has posed for me in this current moment is who gets to choose which stories are told? And what I've concluded is that it all depends on who you ask. David says one of the most amazing things that they've been able to discover through research has been more information about refugee camps after the Union Army retook Clarksville. There are letters that describe Clarksville as a safe haven that allowed people to escape the cruel treatment of enslavement.
So folks from Kentucky, Robertson County, Montgomery County, Stewart County, all coming into this very small town at the time, Clarksville, only a couple thousand residents. And what began as a impromptu living situation around military encampments in the city. By the spring of 1864, it became an officially established refugee camp. So it had a government farm and buildings to support everything. The idea being that the military was going to officially take care of this population of recently emancipated African American people. Eventually, the Freedmen's Bureau was established by the federal government that helped further the efforts of the camp on other camps all over the Southeast. But the story, other than the fact that there were free African Americans living around military encampments in Clarksville, the story's never been told, ever. And the size of this camp doubled the population of Clarksville at the time. There were smaller camps outside of this big camp in Clarksville. One of them sat right here, right where we're standing at. Long before this water was ever impounded, and all through this area, there was a small village called AfricanAmerican. And that was a collection of recently emancipated people from surrounding plantations that were forging their identity, they were forging their community, and expressing their newfound freedom at a time or just a year before they were enslaved.
Many people don't realize that when the Civil War began in Clarksville, half of the population of the city and the county was enslaved. Their experience during the Civil War in Clarksville has its own different story that has hardly been touched.
These stories have also unveiled what I would say are people just as deserving of statues and memorializations and buildings named after them as any of our white forefathers in Clarksville. And these are true stories of heroism and what citizenry really means, and what survival means survival through tremendously or seemingly insurmountable odds. In the cases of the 101st or AfricanAmerican or Scuff Town, did it behoove the white community to remember any of that? No, absolutely not. All it does is serve to remind them that the Confederacy lost, right? And that's part of what the Lost Cause movement is. In the 1890s, the Lost Cause are now part of what everybody around here for 10 generations has grown up learning and believing, and to say something different then creates cognitive dissonance. There's a lot of power in narrative. There's a tremendous amount of power in narrative. And who controls that narrative is going to determine what people 10 generations from now believe about themselves.
When we talk about redlining, specifically in this country, when you look at how highways are created, those are going to be your direct indicators in regards to where the wealth gap is, right? Like you can look at cities like Nashville, like when you look at these highways going through cities like Nashville, Detroit, Raleigh, North Carolina, Durham, North Carolina, a lot of different places. And what happens is when you have individuals in various different municipals, city councils, counties, et cetera, when they go on to vote where money is being allocated for education, where money's being allocated for building upkeep, et cetera, you see stark differences on this side of the highway versus another side of the highway. And so when we see those type of things that are happening, it's a direct reminder of things that have happened intentionally across the course of history in this country that keeps things very divisive and that keeps access harder to get for some individuals versus other individuals.
We've gone through these different phases. There was emancipation from slavery. So we have over 200 years of enslavement by the time that happens. And then we have another 100 years of social and economic oppression. The Black Codes, Jim Crow laws, redlining, all of these things that make it difficult for minority groups. And so then we get to the civil rights movement, and we still have the structure of racial hierarchy in our society. It's still there, and I think people tried to tell themselves it wasn't there as much as we thought.
You have these different hierarchies that were put in place, right? based on the construct of race, because we know that race is not something that's real. It was implemented to make sure that certain individuals were not given a fair shot at accelerating at a rate that other individuals are given, right? So when you have those different measures put in place, multiple people from various different facets are going to feel marginalized. And when we look at those type of those groups, we can talk about African Americans, we can talk about indigenous folks, we can talk about Afro-Indigenous folks, we can talk about Asians, we can talk about Hispanics, we can talk about women, we can talk about a lot of these individuals who were fallen under this hierarchy that predominantly white men ruled. And that has been something that has, of course, been permeated throughout this country for years and years and years. Everyone has felt the brunt of it in some way, shape, or form, if you weren't alike, right?
History has different kinds of themes throughout time. Sometimes you have what's called the great men theory of history, where you only hear about what the men of power did during that time. Who was the general? Who was the leader? Who conquered what land? What army did what? All of that, right? There's a layer underneath that of real people living their real lives. And all those things that we've learned about, those dates, those battles, those leaders, they affect everyone, they do. But social and cultural history is about all the groups.
Critical race theory has been taught. This is not something that is completely brand new. It's been taught via documentaries. It's been taught in classrooms. It's been taught in community organizations as it relates to how race has affected individuals over a span of generations. And the only way that you can talk about those things is if you give specifics, examples. You have to have examples to what this is. And fortunately enough for this country, there's plenty of examples in which why you can have the conversation on critical race theory. So when we have these governors in these southern states, and even some other states outside of southern states and Midwestern states as well, who don't want to talk about these things, they're doing that from a space of privilege. Period, point blank. They're doing it from a space of privilege, and they don't want to go there, right? No one wants to be exposed as being the quote-unquote bad guy, but the thing is, this does not point at anyone being a bad person. This just points out the exact truth, things that factually happened in this country, and people who love history, people that want to understand how humans interact with each other, have to have a comprehensive framework on what that looks like, and CRT provides that.
It's something that I think has to be a constant self-evaluation, right? Of how am I propping up systems that empower me over somebody else? Systemic racism is the way that racism, in this case specifically against African American citizens, but against anybody really, but it's the way that it is codified and embedded in the way that we interact, in the way that we conduct business, the way that we conduct government, the way that we relate to each other. It's embedded in those interactions and relationships.
A lot of Northerners are coming here, and we're not so countrified anymore, right? Everybody wants to come down and get these big farms and create their own businesses down here in the South because it's cheaper. But the problem with that is that it unfortunately pressures people who've always lived in these spaces to try to keep up, because mortgage goes higher, rent goes higher, everything goes higher. And if there's nothing that's put in place here as it relates to living wages and things like that, that can accompany the new wave of individuals that are coming in, gentrifying the space, then unfortunately people who've always been here, families for generations and generations, get left out. I think that our K-12 system in this country has failed a lot of individuals. For instance, I thought that the Confederate flag was my flag because I lived in the South, and I thought Andrew Jackson was a hero. Period, point blank. In this city, I tell you what, I went to Barksdale Elementary School and a couple other schools, and I don't care if you couldn't afford any other school field trip, you were going to the Hermitage. Period. You were going to learn about Andrew Jackson. They didn't discuss the institution of slavery, but they discussed how he was a hero through the Indian Wars, Indian Removal Act, and all these other things, right? So this is something that has to be discussed. It's not to demonize anyone. It's just to tell the truth. And if you're a good parent, then you will wrap that truth up and teach your kids effectively how to be a good human as well, regardless of what information that they hear.
One of the things that we uncovered in research was that the area of the refugee camp in Clarksville is what became known as Scuff Town by the 1870s. And from the 1870s to the 1930s, it was known as Scuff Town. This was the heart, at that time, of the black community in Clarksville. It is still an African-American neighborhood today. So today, the neighborhoods around Austin Peay, north and east of Austin Peay, Lincoln Homes, moving over to where Vulcan Corporation used to be, and then coming over to what is traditionally known as Brandon's Hill, which would be moving down south towards Commerce Street. All of those neighborhoods are traditionally African American, and they have their roots in this refugee camp from 1864, and it's continuously been occupied ever since. In fact, in 1868, 69, 1870, when the military had left, the Freedmen's Bureau was closing, and folks had to start buying property or start renting property. All the first purchasers of lots in those neighborhoods were African-American women, which is, I still don't understand the answer to that, as to why, but it's still incredible that here it is that not even 1870 African-American women are becoming property owners. So it's impactful on two fronts, right? At least. But even today, that neighborhood, this is just being frank. When I was a child, let's say in my teens, in the 1990s, Lincoln Homes, you don't go to Lincoln Homes. That's where you go to buy drugs. That's where you go. If you're going to go over there, you might get cut or shot or something like that. Or something, your car will get stolen or whatever. So is any of that based in reality? No, it's not. But when we look at the traditional narrative about that neighborhood, going back to Scuff Town, it's the exact same thing. The only things the newspapers ever published about this neighborhood were those exact same narratives. There's nothing there but prostitutes and bootleggers and knife fights back in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. It's the same stuff that you're hearing today in these neighborhoods. And it has nothing to do with what the reality is. It has to do with everybody's, the white community's fear.
When we talk about history, it's telling how we choose to describe situations. Clarksville historians are working to reroute the narrative.
These are the words of a man named Joseph Farley, and he says, "I was a slave way back in 1856.
They were mighty hard on colored people. They hung two men by the neck right where I was living. Back in those days, colored people couldn't leave their homes without a pass from their master or mistress. You couldn't even go to church. If you did, you were caught on the highway by the paddle rollers and beat up. Back there, they bought and sold colored people just like they do horses and mules now. Many husbands, wives, and children were separated then and never met again. They had contraband camps, and men and women and children had to be guarded to keep the rebels from carrying them back to the white folks. I lay there in the woods all day until night. When I got there, then I enlisted in the Army."
He goes on to say that the veterans of the United States Colored Troops stood against the KKK in Clarksville. Have you seen that anywhere? Not commonly talked about, right? Whenever you had veterans of the United States Colored Troops living in a southern town, it counteracted the KKK. And this group of men stood against the KKK in Clarksville when they tried to attack another black man. They still had their weapons, and they met them in the street. And Joseph Farley tells us about it. He also says he saw during the Civil War, this is unheard of, and I verified it in the census records, it's true. He witnessed a black soldier marry a white woman inside Fort Defiance. And I look up their census records, and it was a man named Cyrus Cook was the groom, and they moved down to Nashville afterwards, and they did live out their life as a married couple in Nashville, as a biracial couple in the 1870s. Joseph Farley is buried in Evergreen Cemetery across from Greenwood Cemetery.
Words are probably the single most powerful thing on this planet, right? How we describe one another, how we talk to each other has the power to heal or it has the power to destroy. So in the case of interpreting these stories, when we're talking through these stories to the public, the way we describe the people involved is essential. And so three things come to my mind specifically. One is we tend to look at the Civil War as the Confederacy and the Union. Those are two terms that we use a lot, right? Confederacy was the Confederacy, but oftentimes the Union is a way to avoid saying the United States Army. Because the United States Army carries a weight with it. And you're like, oh, well, I support the Army. I support the military, right? You know, most folks around Clarksville will say that today. These are the same folks that are at Fort Campbell, Kentucky today. When you say the Union, now our culture has colored that so much through understanding that it just seems like a foreign, or in the case of some traditional Southern understanding, an invading force. So we tend to, in traditional language and interpretive language, talk about slaves and slave owners. Well, what that does, it lets the enslaver, in this case, off the hook. It lets them, distances them from the reality of owning a person. Not a slave, a person, right? And so when we use the term enslaver, it places them in a position of action, because owning somebody is not passive. Even if it is part of the culture, even if it is accepted by the standards of the moment, you are still an enslaver if you owned people at this time, right? As chattel property. The flip side of this is slave versus enslaved. So when we say slave, that connotates identity. We're placing that person where we've removed gender, we've removed skin color, we've removed name, we've removed religion, we've removed creed, everything, and they are slave. And that's the identity when we use the term slave. So when we flip that around and make it a person first term, we use the term enslaved. So now it's something that's happened to them, and we can say enslaved blacksmith, an enslaved field hand, an enslaved carpenter, an enslaved cook. Because, or you can say, especially even better if we know their names, you know, we can say Alec Barker, an enslaved blacksmith at Dunbar Cave, as opposed to one of the slaves at Dunbar Cave.
When we commemorate the U.S. colored troops, we have 30 of them in the cemetery. We have a Buffalo soldier in the cemetery, and we have a World War II vet. We have more veterans probably from other wars in there. We just haven't come across their documentation or their tombstones. But when we celebrate those veterans, we are telling people in the Army now, in the Air Force, in the Navy, yes, you definitely are valued. We're not just saying that to be nice. We really do value you, and we back up what we say.
If you believe in equality, if you truly believe in being egalitarian and a humanitarian, and those are your values and ideals, have to acknowledge it. And there is a resistance in our country to acknowledging it.
I think in certain communities, people have been able to keep their history galvanized, but in other areas, it has become so intentionally whitewashed and so intentionally driven to where it's designed to make you forget about it, or identify it as being so painful that you don't even want to go there to research it. And the fact of the matter is, all Black history is not what people think. It's not this sad sorrow melody, if you will. We've got a lot of great history as well. We have a lot of history that points to the resilience of individual spirits in making sure that even though they're a couple of steps behind or more than a couple of steps behind, we've done the same thing through hard work, through believing in each other, leaning on each other, and making sure that we want to tell our own narrative and change the narrative, not only in the past, but also in the future, and going forward for future generations. So, yes, there has been a lot of Black history that has been erased, a ton of it. But, I think the ancestors are speaking, and there's a lot of it that's coming to light right now. And I hope that people keep embracing it.